Before starting the story, please like and subscribe the channel. I am just an old lad that is trying hard to get by. Okay, let's dive into the story. Please listen till the end, because the ending will shock you. I've always been a graffiti artist. Some call it art, others see it as vandalism. For me, it's a passion. Unlike most in my community, I prefer quieter, abandoned places to leave my mark. Old train lines are perfect. Endless cars and minimal risk of running into anyone. My friend Jake usually tags along, even though he's not into graffiti. He's more about the vibe and the weed, so we often end up smoking while I work. One night we found a set of deserted tracks and settled in. The rusting train cars were untouched, a canvas waiting for me. As I sprayed my first tag, Jake smoked another joint nearby. The night was quiet, save for the hiss of the spray paint and our occasional murmurs. I moved from car to car, my art coming to life under the moonlight. After discarding my empty cans, we heard it, a clang from somewhere down the line. We froze, adrenaline spiking. The sound came again, followed by the unmistakable clatter of a paint can. Then a voice, angry and hoarse, echoed through the darkness. "You better not trip, boy." We ran, our hearts pounding. A gunshot cracked the night behind us, sending us into a blind panic. We didn't stop until we reached a main road. Out of breath and terrified, we made it back to the car and drove home in silence. The fear lingered, gnawing at me. Weeks later, I returned to those tracks during the day, armed this time. My tags were gone, replaced by red paint. A door on one of the cars was open. Inside, I found a chair, ropes, and the overwhelming smell of bleach. Before I could investigate further, a metallic clang from deeper in the train sent me running. The memory of that night still haunts me. The chair, the bleach, and the voice that nearly ended my life. Jake and I didn't speak much about that night. We both preferred to bury the fear and move on. But as the weeks passed, the curiosity gnawed at me. Who was out there? Why did they react so violently? One evening, Jake and I sat in his basement, smoking and playing video games. The room was filled with a haze of smoke and the muffled sounds of gunfire and explosions from the game. As we played, I could tell Jake was itching to bring up the incident. His eyes kept darting toward me, and he seemed more fidgety than usual. Finally, he paused the game and looked at me, his eyes serious. "Do you think we should go back?" he asked. The question hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. I took a deep breath, considering the idea. The fear was still fresh, but so was the curiosity. I nodded slowly. "Yeah, but this time, we go prepared." We spent the next few days gathering supplies. Jake managed to borrow a pair of walkie-talkies from his cousin, and I picked up a couple of flashlights and a knife from a local outdoor store. Jake suggested we go during the day this time, hoping that daylight would offer some protection or at least make us feel safer. The day we chose to return was overcast, with dark clouds hanging low in the sky. We parked the car a bit farther away this time, not wanting to draw any attention. The walk to the tracks was silent, each step filled with growing tension. When we arrived, the train was still there, just as I remembered it. The air was thick with the smell of rust and decay. We cautiously approached the train, our eyes scanning for any sign of movement. "Let's start at the car where we left off," Jake suggested, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded in agreement, gripping my flashlight tightly. The car was still open, and the smell of bleach hit us like a wall. I stepped inside first, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The chair was still there, along with the ropes. But now there were scratches on the walls, deep gouges that hadn't been there before. "What the hell happened here?" Jake muttered, stepping in behind me. I didn't respond, too focused on the scene in front of me. The scratches looked fresh, as if someone or something had been trapped here, desperately trying to claw their way out. "Let's keep moving," I said, my voice shaking slightly. We made our way through the train, checking each car. Most were empty, but a few contained more disturbing signs. A torn piece of clothing, a bloody handprint, a discarded shoe. As we reached the end of the train, we heard it again, the metallic clang. This time it was much closer, just a few cars away. We froze, our hearts pounding in our chests. The sound was followed by a low growl, a sound that sent chills down my spine. "Run!" Jake shouted, and we bolted back the way we came, our flashlights bouncing wildly. The growl grew louder, and I could hear footsteps pounding behind us. We burst out of the train and didn't stop running until we reached the car. We jumped in, locking the doors and speeding away, not daring to look back. The drive back was a blur. We didn't speak, the adrenaline still coursing through our veins. When we finally reached Jake's house, we sat in the car, breathing heavily. "What the hell was that?" Jake finally asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I replied, my mind racing. "But whatever it was, it's not something we should mess with." That night I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside my window made me jump, and I kept replaying the events in my mind. The growl, the footsteps, the scratches on the walls. It all pointed to something far more sinister than a simple homeless person or a crazy drifter. The next day I did some research. I spent hours on the internet, looking for any information about strange occurrences on abandoned train tracks. I found a few urban legends and ghost stories, but nothing concrete. It seemed like no one had experienced anything quite like what we had. Days turned into weeks, and the fear began to fade, replaced by a burning curiosity. I knew I had to go back, but this time I needed to be smarter. I decided to bring more people, a group of friends who were into the paranormal. They had equipment and experience, and I hoped they could help us figure out what was happening. We planned the trip for a Saturday afternoon. The group consisted of myself, Jake, and 3 of my friends. Emily, a self-proclaimed psychic, Mike, a tech enthusiast with a bunch of ghost-hunting gadgets, and Rachel, who was just as curious as I was. We arrived at the tracks around 3 p.m., the sun still high in the sky. The train looked even more ominous in the daylight, its rusting exterior casting long shadows. Emily led the way, her eyes closed as she tried to sense any spirits or energies. Mike followed closely behind, his gadgets beeping and whirring. Jake and Rachel brought up the rear, keeping a lookout. As we approached the open car, Emily stopped abruptly. "There's something here," she said, her voice low. "Something angry." Mike's gadgets went crazy, the lights flashing and beeping loudly. "There's definitely some kind of energy here," he confirmed, looking at his readings. We entered the car cautiously, our flashlights cutting through the dim light. The chair was still there, but now there were more ropes, and the smell of bleach was even stronger. "This is where we heard the growl," I said, pointing to the scratches on the walls. Emily closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. "I can feel it," she whispered. "It's like a presence, something dark and twisted." Mike set up his equipment, placing motion sensors and cameras around the car. "Let's see if we can capture anything," he said, adjusting the settings. We spent the next few hours exploring the train, documenting everything we found. There were more signs of a struggle, torn clothing, bloodstains, and more scratches. It was clear that something terrible had happened here. As the sun began to set, we gathered in the open car, reviewing the footage and readings. Suddenly we heard it, the metallic clang, followed by the low growl. This time, we were ready. Mike's cameras picked up movement at the end of the car, a shadowy figure that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. Emily gasped, clutching her chest. "It's here," she said, her voice shaking. "It's right here." The growl grew louder, and the temperature dropped suddenly. We could see our breath, and the air felt heavy, oppressive. The shadow moved closer, and we could see it more clearly. A tall, dark figure with glowing eyes. "Get out!" Emily screamed, her voice filled with terror. "We have to get out now." We didn't need any more convincing. We grabbed our equipment and ran, the shadow chasing us. We could hear its growl, feel its presence right behind us. We burst out of the train and didn't stop running until we reached the car. We jumped in, locking the doors and speeding away, not daring to look back. The ride back was silent, everyone lost in their thoughts. The fear was palpable, and no one knew what to say. When we finally reached my house, we gathered in the living room, trying to process what had happened. "What was that thing?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling. She had been the quietest of the group, but now the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. "I don't know," I admitted, still shaken. "But it was real. We all saw it." Emily nodded, her face pale. "It's not just a ghost or spirit. It's something much darker, much more powerful." Mike reviewed the footage, his hands shaking as he tried to steady the camera. "We definitely captured something. Look at this," he said, pointing to the screen. The shadowy figure flickered in and out, its glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. "Can we enhance it?" Jake asked, leaning in closer. "I'll try," Mike replied, adjusting the settings. The figure became clearer, its outline more defined. It was tall, with elongated limbs and a hunched posture. The eyes were the most unsettling part. They seemed almost human, but with an unnatural glow. "We need to find out what this is," Emily said, her voice resolute. "There has to be some way to understand what we're dealing with." The next few days were a blur of research and restless nights. We scoured the internet for any information on similar sightings, paranormal entities, or urban legends connected to abandoned trains. We found fragments of stories, whispers of encounters, but nothing that matched our experience. One evening, as we gathered to review our findings, Jake brought up an idea. What if we consult someone who knows about this stuff, like a professional paranormal investigator or a historian who specializes in local legends? It was a long shot, but it was the best lead we had. After some searching, we found a local historian named Dr. Evelyn Carter, who had written extensively about the region's folklore and paranormal occurrences. We reached out to her, explaining our situation without revealing too much detail. Dr. Carter agreed to meet us at her office, a small, cluttered space filled with books, maps, and artifacts. She was an older woman with a sharp intellect and a keen interest in the supernatural. "So, you've encountered something unusual on the old train tracks," she said, her eyes narrowing as she studied us. "Tell me everything." We recounted our experiences, from the initial tagging night to our recent encounter with the shadowy figure. Dr. Carter listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes. "Interesting," she murmured when we finished. "There are a few local legends about those tracks. They've been abandoned for decades, but there are stories of disappearances and sightings of strange figures." She pulled out a worn book, flipping through the pages until she found what she was looking for. "Here it is," she said, showing us an old newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Mysterious Disappearances on Old Train Tracks." The article detailed several cases of people going missing in the area, all centered around the abandoned train tracks. Some had been found later, disoriented and with no memory of what had happened. Others were never seen again. "There's one legend in particular that stands out," Dr. Carter continued. "It's about a man who was wrongfully accused of a crime and executed near those tracks. They say his spirit haunts the area, seeking revenge on anyone who trespasses." A chill ran down my spine as I listened. It sounded like a typical ghost story, but given what we had seen, it was hard to dismiss. "Is there any way to communicate with it?" Emily asked, her curiosity piqued. Dr. Carter nodded. "There are rituals that might allow you to make contact. But be warned, these entities are not to be taken lightly. If you provoke it, the consequences could be severe." We left Dr. Carter's office with a mixture of fear and determination. We had a plan: to return to the tracks and try to communicate with the entity. It was risky, but we needed answers. The following Saturday, we gathered our equipment and set out for the tracks once more. This time, we were prepared not just with our gear, but with a sense of purpose. We needed to know what we were dealing with. As we approached the train, the air seemed heavier, the atmosphere more oppressive. The sun was setting, casting long shadows that danced ominously around us. "We should start with the ritual," Emily suggested, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. She had brought along some candles, incense, and a few other items that Dr. Carter had recommended. We found a relatively open space near the train and set up the candles in a circle. Emily lit the incense, the fragrant smoke curling into the air. She began to chant softly, her words a mixture of English and something ancient that I couldn't understand. The air grew colder, and the oppressive feeling intensified. We could see our breath, and the shadows around us seemed to grow darker, more solid. "Show yourself," Emily called out, her voice echoing in the stillness. "We mean you no harm. We seek only to understand." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the ground beneath us seemed to tremble, and a low growl resonated through the air. The candles flickered, and the shadowy figure appeared at the edge of the circle. It was the same figure we had seen before, tall with elongated limbs and glowing eyes. But now it seemed more substantial, more real. The eyes fixed on us, filled with an intensity that made my blood run cold. "Why are you here?" Emily asked, her voice trembling slightly. The figure didn't respond with words, but a wave of emotion washed over us. Anger, pain, and a deep, unending sorrow. It was overwhelming, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "Can you tell us your name?" Emily pressed, her voice softer now. Again, there were no words, but images flashed in my mind. A man bound and beaten. A dark, cold place. The sound of a train whistle in the distance. It was as if the entity was sharing its memories, its suffering. "We're sorry for what happened to you," Emily said, her voice choked with emotion. "We want to help you find peace." The figure seemed to waver, its form flickering. The growl turned into a low, mournful wail, a sound that was filled with unimaginable grief. "What can we do?" Emily asked, desperation in her voice. The response was immediate. The figure pointed toward the train, its glowing eyes intense. I felt a sudden compulsion to follow, as if being pulled by an invisible force. We moved toward the train, the figure leading the way. It stopped at the car with a chair and ropes, the smell of bleach still strong. The figure pointed to the chair, and I understood. This was where it had happened, where the man had suffered and died. "We need to free you," Emily said, her voice determined. "We need to release you from this place." She began to chant again, the words resonating in the air. The candles flickered and flared, and the shadows seemed to dance around us. The figure wavered, its form becoming less distinct, as if being pulled away. Suddenly the air grew even colder, and a new figure appeared. A man, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, his face twisted in rage. He was the one who had wronged the entity, the source of its suffering. The two figures clashed, their forms intertwining in a battle of wills. The air was filled with their cries, a cacophony of anger and pain. We watched, helpless, as they struggled. "Keep chanting," Emily urged, her voice rising above the noise. We joined in, our voices blending with hers. The air shimmered, and the figures seemed to weaken, their forms flickering. With a final, desperate wail, the figures dissipated, leaving only a heavy silence in their wake. The air grew warmer, and the oppressive feeling lifted. We stood there stunned, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. "We did it," Emily whispered, her voice filled with awe. "We actually did it." We packed up our equipment and left the tracks, the sense of peace and relief washing over us. We had faced the unknown and come out the other side.